whether we're making governance choice or a policy decision or a regulation, to say that's going to yield an unallayed good, it's neither accurate nor strategic. Some people are going to experience good things out of that decision, undoubtedly. Some people are going to experience bad things or things that are mixed.
Hello and welcome back to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining. I'm Eric Young. Joining me today is Paul Hirsch, Professor of Environmental Studies at State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, where he directs the graduate programming in environmental leadership and decision making. Paul, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to have you here because you are someone who has actually published a number of different papers focusing on the question of how do we make trade-offs, and specifically making trade-offs in environmental governance situations. I guess they were all written over a decade ago now that you were focusing on that specific topic. So I appreciate you kind of coming on and being willing to try to pull up your memory on this. I'm keen to get into this with you.
Thanks. No, I mean, when I learned that your focus was trade-off, maybe the key papers were maybe a decade plus ago, but actually it's still really the thinking and the work and the collaborations behind that are things that are still unfolding and central to, I think, to environmental decision-making and maybe decision-making even more broadly. So still working on it.
Okay, so then let's start with your hook or elevator pitch. If anyone is only going to listen to the first 5 minutes of this podcast, what's the message that you'd hope they'd take home with them?
I think decisions, broadly speaking, and certainly decisions in the environmental space, they take place in very complex milieus that are characterized, to start with, by both, on the one hand, scientific uncertainty or technical uncertainty, and on the other hand, let's call it social ambiguity. That is, that different people see different things, think in different ways, and want different things. So you've got this interplay between scientific/technical uncertainty and then different ways of understanding, wanting, needing, and thinking. And the interplay or the entanglement about those things means that whether we're making kind of a governance choice or a policy decision or a regulation, to say that that's going to yield an unallayed good, it's neither accurate nor strategic. You know, some people are going to experience good things out of that decision, undoubtedly, and some people are going to experience bad things or things that are mixed, and then some things we just don't know how they're going to play out.
Yeah.
So it's not accurate to just, be touting the unallayed good or really the unallayed bad.
You're talking about win-win outcomes.
It's not accurate. You win. That's right. I would say the win-win rhetoric, win-win framing of complex problems is neither accurate nor strategic. So we talked about why it's not accurate, and it's not strategic because people are going to experience losses, right? The reality is that people are going to experience losses. And whether you care about conservation or whether you care about economic development, hopefully you care about both, both of those things matter over the long term. And if people experience those losses and they're not acknowledged, right? Mitigated perhaps, or grieved or healed or whatever we need to do, then you lost your constituency over the long term for whatever it is you're trying to achieve. And like I said, those things really only matter over the long term. But on the other side of that doesn't mean, therefore, we should be paralyzed.
Yeah.
And we should always say more research is necessary before we make decisions. And it also doesn't mean that this interplay of ambiguity and uncertainty can be just kind of reduced by some kind of algorithmic or technical set of tools. But they're never going to be enough given the types of complexity that we're talking about. So what's really required is discussions about values, discussions about what's important, what are we trying to preserve? What really matters and to whom? And, what are the pathways forward that are feasible, possible, that we're looking at? And then how, along those different pathways, are we going to fight for, work for, try to develop in ways that allow us to uphold those values that we hold dear, what it is we've deemed most important to preserve, even in the face of losses, sacrifices, things to grieve, mitigate, and heal.
And then what happens when we bump up against two conflicting values, or we have to make a decision that's going to have trade-offs across different values, or even the same value for different people, or the same value for the same people in different periods. Well, so this is super exciting to me because this is what I have at times thought that I'm researching during my PhD project, which is now, I'm 2 years in and 2 years out. So then tell me how you got to be researching this question. Give us the background on how you end up focusing on the question of trade-offs and values, and kind of what a research project in this framing even looks like.
Kind of felt that what's important is to be able to talk about complicated things in ordinary language and regular words, having some adequate knowledge in a few different fields, but it's different than being a specialist in one field, which is often the way that our education system, particularly in master's, PhD, pushes us to do. And I'm not saying it's not helpful to become a specialist. If the point is that what we're talking about when we're talking about trade-offs is different types of things that can't be boiled down into one common metric. The economist can help us understand a lot, and the ecologist can help us understand a lot. But rather than kind of arguing about whose metric is the right metric, I think it can be useful to understand what they're both doing. I mean, what these really important ways of understanding the world are doing, what they're teaching us, but being able to kind of, again, talk in ordinary language. And that comes from my PhD advisor, Brian Norton. He passed that phrase along to me wherever he got it, but it's really important to be able to talk about values and complex environmental issues in ordinary language. And I was, in terms of specifically how I got into this, right when I was finishing my PhD, Brian and I were invited to participate. Really interesting project. It was a global project funded by the MacArthur Foundation at that time. And there was partners from the United States, England, other places in Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America. The specific countries were Peru, Tanzania, and Vietnam. What we were trying to do, the MacArthur Foundation was really getting a little bit tired of win-win rhetoric in all these grant proposals, right? Hey, we're going to do this initiative. It's going to be ecotourism, whatever it is, and it's going to be win-win, right? We're going to create economic opportunity for people, and we're going to do that by preserving ecosystems and bringing in, additional money and resources to the region. And I think MacArthur's experience, or anybody who's been around these projects for a long time, knows that there may be some great wins, but it's not so simple. There's costs, there's losses, there's real impacts on people and communities that are not meaningful to be talked about in win-win terms. So they were looking at how do we develop language, whether it's in our grant proposals or the way we evaluate them or the way we communicate our work, that takes into account trade-offs. So they brought together economists, ecologists, anthropologists, people from these multiple working in different regions, living in these different regions to try to have this conversation over the course of a few years. I got involved a little bit after it started. What my interest was in that and why they allowed me to stay involved, which was really a great experience. How do we talk about these things, not just relying on the disciplinary language? I mean, if you've been around like different academics from different disciplines, it becomes challenging to figure out how to kind of think integratively across them. I find that kind of fun, right? Not necessarily to come up with a universal package, like this is how it all fits together. And I don't think you can do that, but you can say like, hey, on Monday, let's talk in this kind of language. And on Tuesday, let's talk in this kind of language.
Yeah.
And on Wednesday, let's talk in this kind of language. And then on Friday, let's throw all that, let's see what we learned just in regular human being language. If there is that, right? Let's try to see what comes out of that. I mean, it's a little more complicated, I guess, because you have to provide appropriate structure for what happens on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday and so forth, and on Friday. But ultimately, if I have to describe what I've kind of understood, often what my role is, if I'm fortunate to be able to do that, is to help with that process, right? To help find ways to provide enough structure so that people from different disciplines, different worldviews, et cetera, can very meaningfully offer what they have to offer in terms of their appreciation of the issues at hand, so that somehow we can kind of all be citizens or regular people or the public and just talk about this stuff. That doesn't take away the fact that there's hard choices of cost, of course, right? Those are still be made, but we've at least created a set of frameworks that we can kind of openly, honestly, or meaningfully about them. I mean, when you ask how to structure research around that, I get the challenge, right? Because say more. I mean, it's a great thing to discuss.
And so I imagine that in this project, you were looking at some specific environmental governance issues in different parts of the world.
That's right.
And then you had a little bit of the meta role to try to see what was happening in these different sort of repeated situations that were happening here and there, and then try to pull something common out of all of that. And then was it your idea to focus on this concept of trade-offs, or that was a little bit handed?
That was really, I guess that was MacArthur, and then the leader of the project, a guy named Tom McShane, who's worked in conservation for quite a long time, and I'm not exactly sure. I think that was his original analysis of the founding conversations was, I think we're talking about trade-offs. Maybe my contribution, or certainly emerged out of conversations that I was heavily involved in, was the idea of saying that let's not just talk about trade-offs, and I'll say more about that in a second, but let's talk about complex trade-offs. So I think
Okay.
that was if I brought something to the table, I think it was closer to that. And why? Because two things. I mean, one, trade-offs could be taken to mean, okay, what we're talking about is measurable costs and measurable benefits. Let's measure the costs, let's measure the benefits, let's see which one is bigger, and then that'll tell us what decision to make and what to do. And the
Mm,
point about that we were dealing with social vulnerability, poverty, ecosystem degradation, all sorts of things, diverse cultures, you're not measuring everything in those terms of kind of quantifiable costs and benefits. So we didn't want a discussion about trade-offs to kind of be reduced in that terms. Again, not that that's not a useful reduction and to tell you something, but that's not going to be the whole story. And the second point was, I mean, we were an international team, different languages, and even the term trade offs. I remember we were just talking about it one day, and our colleagues from Vietnam said, well, the closest I'm able to translate that is negotiating from a position of weakness.
really?
Yeah. And I obviously I can't verify that translation or comment on that really. So the first paper that came out of that work was called Hard Choices. And I think that was something that really everybody could relate to. And that was maybe that's the best ordinary language way to talk about it still. I pose complex trade offs as a way to say there are gains and losses, but they're not things that can be easily measured or compared. We may be understanding them in different ways. There may be different time scales. There may be issues of how we frame the problem that come into
Yeah.
play. So that was, for lack of a better term, may still yet emerge. Like to me, that communicates something.
Yeah. Well, then I really like your distinction between integrative and integrated in your 2015 paper. And I feel that ties into also this concept of what you mean by a complex trade off. Because when I think about what kind of cost versus benefit or cost benefit analysis, that is assuming that we can compare things on some sort of common metric or get things onto the same scale. And so, yeah, so explain the distinction between integrated and integrative
Okay,
and why that's.
and for that, I really have to give credit to an anthropologist named Peter Brosius. I took his class when I was in my master's program, and we can talk about it. But it kind of blew my mind in certain ways, and he was one of the key organizers of this initiative. So I was able to work with him, move from kind of being a student to being a colleague. And I'm pretty sure, if I remember right, that distinction between integrative and integrated was something that he was really clear
Yeah.
about and pushing. And what that is saying that integrated implies a sort of coherent output. It's a substantive way of talking about things. We have this integrated output that we produced, like the cost benefit analysis. We've integrated all these different factors and we have this number, this ratio of cost to benefits or benefits to cost, depending on how we
Hmm.
put it. And we can think about that in other kinds of outputs. But integrative, it's a process. It's like what I was talking about, the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday thing. I mean, integrative is saying we're going to do our best we can to make space to be inclusive of the different perspectives that come to bear on the complex trade-offs we're dealing with and allow those trade-offs to be represented in terms that are meaningful to the variety of people that we're trying to be in dialogue with. And so that's an integrative process. What comes out of that could very well be and is likely to be, and we talked about, there's going to be certain things that we can agree on. We can get to what those might look like, but there's going to be gaps as well. And so we're going to have to sometimes bridge the gaps, get a little more integrated, but often
Hmm.
mind the gaps and still be integrative, but by no means try to push too hard for some sort of unified or coherent single output of the
This
work.
is really, I mean, I've been thinking about this now for the better part of 2 years, how to integrate different values, different important aspects of a decision without collapsing them into one common scale. And yeah, I think it's really hard to hold that in your mind. Like, okay, it's one thing to understand that we're all going to speak differently about all these different things, and then if we have to make a decision, we have to somehow get all those things together. And what I liked about the integrated, it is somehow getting all these things. You're still integrating all of these things. You're still bringing them together. You're still bringing them into contact with one another.
Yes.
You're not turning the fruit salad into a smoothie. You're not blending them all together somehow.
Yeah.
And that
And
seems just hard and messy.
It is hard and messy, but like if you think about thinking, which is what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to think.
Mhm.
And we're trying to think about hard things together. That's why integrative works, right? Because when it works is when having that fruit salad, as you say, is something we can sort of think with. I mean, even
Yeah,
cost benefit analysis, if you look at its use in policy decision making, at least you learn in school, how it really works. But is that a cost benefit analysis is intended to be an input into regulatory decision making. It's not intended to be the answer,
right.
right? It's supposed to be an input. So if it's an input, there's an explicit recognition that you need an integrated process. We need the cost benefit analysis, but we need some other stuff too, right? We need other kinds of testimony and input into this decision. So I think that's inherent in deliberative decision making is the idea that we need to deliberate, i.e., think together. And so it's not going to be an algorithmic output, maybe a few different algorithms that don't fit together, but then something that's hard to put into an algorithm.
I
Um,
feel like that's helpful from the perspective of a researcher also to remember that at the end of the day, whatever you make is just going to sort of go into somebody's brain somewhere
yeah,
and try to affect their decision along with all of the other things that go into their brain. So whatever you make, whether it's an algorithmic solution, it still transfer into the way that we think about the situations that we're in.
yeah. And how can what you make be helpful for that process? And sometimes that's sort of stepping back, right? Sometimes that's saying, let's think about how we're framing this whole thing and how that's leaving out important aspects of the picture. And sometimes that's okay, let's really drill down and give you some numbers so you can really make some meaningful comparisons.
Is there anything to say about how forcing things into a single unified output is actually counterproductive?
If we're thinking, it's no longer really giving us the tangible things to think about. Let's say we're talking about now ecosystem services. So we're going to use a metaphor that allows us to now count things in the environment. We can count up the ecosystem services. We can count up whatever it is, tourism dollars, whatever we're counting up. But we're no longer thinking about those actual things in their own terms. And so we're losing some ability to critically reflect on real things that happen in the
Yeah.
world. If you look at cost benefit analysis in the context of environmental issues, it's often relatively easy to count up costs of doing something because you got to pay somebody to do it. You got to, maybe there's an opportunity cost, but to measure the benefits is there's so many assumptions. You're talking about discount rates and the future versus today. You're talking about ways of talking about values, which really are not agreed upon. And then you're putting that in a number. You've made a lot of assumptions that you're boiling down into that. And there can be value. I mean, I'm not saying we should never be doing that. I'm not even saying we should never be putting a monetary value on that.
Mm.
But I'm answering your question. Are there costs? Are there trade-offs to doing that? Should we be careful about doing that? Should we understand every time we reduce a complexity and simplify it in those ways, which can be powerful to do, that we're losing information and making assumptions, and there's real people and there's real issues and there's real values.
So a few days ago, I was trying to do some work on this question for the deep sea mining question and try to map out or write down or just get a hold of all the different values and
Mm,
aspects that are relevant to this question. And I was really confronted by the difficulty of getting things to fit cleanly into the category of values.
mm.
So tell me what you think about the word values. How can we get anywhere near defining it? And how do we decide what things count as values and what things don't?
It's very helpful to learn about the canonical, to take your environmental ethics class or what have you, and to be able to talk about values in this kind of broad, abstract way. I think it can be helpful, but I think that's not what we're necessarily talking about when we talk about values in the context of decision making. What are the foundational values? Do we believe in intrinsic values or instrumental values or relational values? Those things are all important. And they can be meaningful discussions to enrich our thinking. But what I mean, when we're facing a hard choice, when we're facing complex trade-offs and we're talking about it, when we're talking together or when we're thinking about it individually, what really matters to us? What are we trying to
Hmm.
preserve? I like the question, what are you trying to preserve? I like the question, what will your guiding principles be as you face this decision? What really matters here in this context? It's sort of a mid-range, okay, between, these big picture kind of freedom or liberty or intrinsic value or those, again, we're not talking about those because you get into those, then we're kind of talking about these sort of almost ideological commitments that we may have to certain kinds of abstract values. So we don't want them to be too abstract. We'd like to minimize the amount of money people are going to have to pay for X, for energy. Notice I said minimize. I didn't say optimizing or maximizing is going to be that helpful, because we've got multiple values at play. When we're talking about trade-offs, we're ultimately going to not just have one value, but two or
Hmm.
three or four. And so we might say things like, let's try to keep at a reasonable level the amount of money people are going to have to pay for whatever it is.
Yeah.
Let's try to protect the capacity of the environment here and be a place that people can find not only meaning, but economic development opportunities. And that was pretty wordy, but you're trying to articulate something that you have in mind, the problem and the set of issues, right? And
Yeah.
from then you start to talk about what matters. And then, of course, that unfolds. Then you say, okay, well, what should we be doing here? What are some pathways forward? And you start to come up with some possible alternatives. But then there's this iterativeness thing that happens, because as we think about alternatives, then we say, oh, wait a minute, I have this other value that wasn't really articulated. But now that I think about this thing we might do, I better say what this value is,
Okay.
right? So there's this kind of iterativeness between what I might say is sort of principles and pathways. What are our principles for making this decision? What are our pathways forward that are on the table that we're considering? Let's merge those two things together, because that helps us think about it, right? The pathways are our tangible, what we're going to do, what we think we might do, and the principles are our values, what we're trying to protect and preserve. But often we kind of only discover one by thinking about the other.
That's helpful, especially so when I translate this into the deep sea mining context, it's often kind of posed as these big values up against one another. It's environmental protection against human welfare via the
Right.
minerals for the energy transition. And then when you dig deeper into what people are thinking about when they're thinking about these things, you get a couple of things. One thing is you get a lot of people are being guided by the same values, just in different directions. So environmental protection, we could be thinking we have to not mine in one area to protect the environment there. We have to not mine in the deep sea because it's going to harm the environment there. And then on the other side of the coin is, well, we should mine here because it's going to then offset mining in the rainforest of Indonesia. And
Right.
then those are both environmental values. And it's tempting to say, well, this maybe they cancel each other out or something. This is a little bit where I find values confusing, because I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
I've got a headline value, and then I can decompose it into sub value categories, and each of those are attached to mechanisms. But when you talk about getting more detail oriented, asking
Yeah.
people kind of what matters in this situation, then you get
Yeah.
a cleaner story in and of itself. I guess it gets a little bit more complicated then, and how you, again, you get farther away from being able to call two different things the same thing. They become two separate pieces of the puzzle, if that makes
Yeah.
any
I think
sense.
you need how you do this in deep sea mining. I mean, I don't want to pretend. I mean, it'd be fun to talk about, but I don't want to pretend to have even know kind of where to begin, because what I want to say is that these things emerge in conversations between people. There's like one classic example, sort of the Quincy Library case, which has to do with your classic tension in the Western United States between logging and protection of species. But you also have people really concerned about wildfires that happen in the forest, and the breakthrough occurred when people started meeting in the Quincy Library, and started really talking about the specific problems they were facing. Okay, I'm worried about fire risk. I'm worried about jobs in this particular context. But it was, to sort of be critical of the environmental side, and recognizing that all sorts of social actors tend to do this thing. But, if you're a national environmental organization looking at that kind of situation, you have a kind of ideological standard position, right? Like, we need to be protecting forests and biodiversity. And
Hmm.
that was getting in the way of meaningful discussions. And to the extent that that national type of environmental organization principle or perspective was imposing pressure on the situation, it was very difficult to have meaningful dialogue and conversation between people who very much cared about the forest and species, but also cared about things like wildfires and livelihoods, and that kind of tense situation is only going to be, I don't even want to say resolved, but You're going to find some meaningful pathways forward and meaningful discussion if you can sort of temper down those larger kind of ideological based value positions.
Say more about the specifics of the Quincy Library case, because um, one of the things that I thought was interesting there was it didn't sound like it was a very over organized process, but there were certain aspects of the fact that it took place in a library that made it more conducive to people listening to one another and having some sort of outcome.
Yeah, and that pays work by Mark Sagoff that's written about that. But I think you sort of said it right there, right? I mean, a library is not kind of neutral territory, right? It represents thinking and information ideas, but it's not a university campus, it's not a specialty lab. I mean, everybody goes to the library, or everybody has been to the library. So, I mean, I think you're putting your finger right there. Like the setting itself implies this ordinary language conversation, right?
Right.
And it implies a civic space, an acceptable civic space. Again, it's a relatively nonpartisan space, and yet clearly information, ideas, knowledge is important
Right.
in the library. So I think, I'm just thinking here kind of out loud with you about it, but the setting itself is kind of right on for being able to have this difficult type of conversation. Also, you can't be too loud in the library.
Right.
Maybe
Just
that's
quiet
good too,
voices.
right? You
Yeah.
got to kind of figure out how to say things in a way that's a little bit measured and metered. That's kind of imbued upon us all the way back to when we're kids, right? We're going to probably be fairly respectful in the library, or at least there's going to be more pressure to do so. And that's,
But
of course, a
that's,
big deal, right? Is the emotional dimension of these things also. That's hard to be patient with those emotions in ourselves and others that come up. Think about what's going on in the Quincy Library case. I mean, these are deep-seated identities that people, not
yeah.
just values, not just interests, but things that are central to who we are and how we define ourselves. And if that feels threatened, it's very hard to be an open-minded thinker when things are feel threatened at that deep level, But if you can find a place, a setting, a context to, in good faith, have conversations about hard things, then you can sort of get this to this point where like, wow, okay, like I mean, that's the point I look for is, wow, this really is complicated.
Yeah.
Whatever side or wherever you stand, you're like, oh, all of a sudden, like if we could, if we talk about deep sea mining together, like that's where I'd like to get to. Like, wow, yeah, okay, Eric, I get why you're into this issue. This really is complicated, but it's that sort of combination of awe and maybe a little curiosity, where now I say, like, I need to learn, I need to understand, different perspectives. And then if we can do that together, then we can probably have a productive conversation about whatever the issue is, and maybe even talk about values. But I agree with you. We've got to be careful. That word values, we don't want it to mean some sort of big canonical values. It's really what matters,
Yeah.
in the context that we're facing as we're sitting in this library, knowing we have to go home to.
Yeah. It's making me think about the settings of the public conversations that I've watched, deep sea mining, and I've had a number of people kind of point this out to me. So it's very often organized around a theme, and it's it's either in an academic setting or it's in an industry kind of conference setting, or I've never been to the International Seabed Authority regulatory meetings, but they, I'm sure, have their own tone, and none of these settings are common language, like you're saying. That's interesting. And it's also very often the case that it's almost in one side's domain. Like you might be going to an industry conference as somebody who isn't in the industry identity, and then you're going to feel out of place. And when you raise a question or make an opposing point, you stand up and raise your hand, then everybody else in that room, they're in their industry identities, and it's influential setting. So that's interesting. I've never thought about that so specifically.
Where is the
before.
library in the context of deep sea mining, or what is the library in the context of deep sea mining?
Right. I would love for it to be, I mean, this is a little bit the goal of my podcast. I try to invite people on from different perspectives and just ask them really easy questions and not get too confrontational about anything. It's always
so we are now in the library of the deep sea mining.
I mean, I would love for it to say that, oh yeah, I'm being the library here, but there's no conversation really. I'm an impartial kind of outsider trying to elicit responses generally in this setting. And I don't think we have established sort of a good dialogue format.
I think I have a little sense of what you're trying to do. And And what I've watched of your podcast and listened to, I mean, I get the feeling that you are creating a space where people can not be purely defined by those roles that you're talking about. They can ask themselves, like, just like in the library, we're all citizens, we're all, members of a community. You have to kind of be able to tap into that shared role. You're not giving up your other role, but you have to be able to have those meaningful conversations. You kind of have to be able to tap that shared role.
Yeah.
In the MacArthur project, in the project that I talked about where we were working on this, I mean, we were fortunate. We got to travel together and be in different places together and spend time together. And that's true of Quincy Library too, and other work that's been done on when there has been meaningful context, let's say in the logging, and environmentalist scenarios out west. I mean, there's other work that's where people are very upfront to say this only worked because we spent some time together hanging out and just being real people with each other, separate from getting into all this dynamics. And so that's why I think why, people criticize we're spending all this money on going out to dinner or whatever it is. But those things
I was just
really
thinking,
provide value.
yeah, I was just thinking it's going to be tough to write that into the research proposal as part of this. We all have to go out for a weekend and drive bumper cars together or something.
I mean, yeah, I guess. But can we all come to Norway and hang out on a boat and have a conversation? That'd be cool.
And now that you mention that, I think that that's actually an interesting aspect of the deep sea mining conversation, because people do hang out. It is a context where people hang out on a boat together, and it's people from they'll do these research cruises, and there'll be some people from the deep sea mining companies who are funding and kind of organizing the cruises, and a bunch of academics and biologists and people. And then, they get stuck on a boat together for 2 weeks.
Yeah, and then you're in the world together, you're in nature together, you're experiencing each other as people. And I think often in the online space, I mean, I've been teaching almost exclusively online for a decade. That allows you to bring together different kinds of people than maybe wouldn't be coming to the same classroom in the same place at the same time. I think we have very meaningful conversations, and I know I'm not alone in that. I think there's ways to create a little bit of trust or shared context in a variety of, with whatever you got.
I want to slide into the distinction between kind of analytic decision making versus process based decision making, if that makes sense.
I think so.
I feel like a lot of what I've learned in the last couple of years of learning about how decision processes work, and I came into it thinking, well, yeah, there's all these trade-offs. If we can just map them out really well and present decision makers with like a really well indexed set of details, then, the best decision will become obvious. I think that's the way a lot of people look at the deep sea mining question. Is like, well, we need more information, sure. But once we get the information, then we can kind of put the costs and benefits up against one another, and the right decision will come out. Versus in what I'm learning, the complex trade-off sort of domain, often you're just, that's too ambitious to analytically determine what you want the right answer to be, and you have to rely a lot more on some sort of process-based process where you set a bunch of people up to have the right sort of interactions, and what comes out of that is going to be kind of the best outcome that you could get to.
I think and have experienced that if you do what you just described, it is possible to yield a workable good, a pathway forward. It's also possible to not do that, right? As we all know, we've all been parts of lots of group efforts that are confusing. So, and don't necessarily yield that. It's possible that the process of thinking together in an integrative fashion about complex trade-offs will yield something that, even if that group doesn't necessarily have formal power, what they come up with will be meaningful and convincing and rich enough to inform and influence the operations of power, like whatever the decision maker actually is, right? Because they'll actually make something. I think of like that process of people come together that you're talking about, like you're making something. And if you make something good, because you've considered the different perspectives and you've articulated, what's important, and you've come up with one or two possibilities, fight another day to protect what's important. I think that's really, it's a point I want to make though. These things, deep sea mining, it's all dynamic, right? We're not making a decision that's going to, you press a button and then that yields a certain output versus pressing the other button, which yields a different output. You're making a decision to kind of um, shape the possibilities and constraints for future development. You're shaping, in a sense, the field that we're going to have to struggle in to protect what's important to us, right? We're still going to have to struggle. We're still going to have to work for it, whether we do X or whether we do Y. The struggle is different in X and Y. The work is different. But what I think we can begin to do is articulate what I'm going to say a workable good, right? Which means that we can envision doing that work along this pathway to protect what's important. If we go this way, it's hard to imagine envisioning the work. I don't think we're going to be up for it,
Hmm.
and that's not a workable good. What I'm saying is I think those processes can yield workable goods that then almost take an energy of their own. Like, yeah, people see the value, we move forward, it becomes policy, it becomes a decision, and it continues to adapt, obviously, as the situation unfolds. Or it might not. But I think we need to recognize that just like cost benefit analysis is just an input, decisions and discussions. I wouldn't want to put such a high bar. Hey, we're going to have this decision and this is going to yield the answer. I don't want to say that deliberation is therefore the answer to how we deal with complexity. It's something we should and can be doing, and we should and can be doing much better, I think, than we're doing, and we can invest in it, and we can think critically about how to do it, and we can do it in an integrative fashion. In the big picture, yes, yield to better solutions, but I'm not going to put a one-on-one.
And I mean, the thing that's really flagging for me here is that is that the decision is also not the end of the process.
Right.
Which, I love it when things are so obvious that you know it all along, but when someone says it, you're like, okay, yeah, I didn't know that. The decision is not the end of the process. This decision is just going to lead us into the next
Yes.
thing that we have to struggle in.
And let's make a decision in a way that, one, allows us to learn more about a couple things. One, about the system, how the system works, right? Let's learn more about the deep sea and the impacts of mining on the deep sea as we make this decision. And let's also learn more about what matters to the people who this impacts as we
Yeah.
make the decision. Because again, there's no better way to learn about what matters than to see how we react as we kind of move down a pathway as stuff starts to happen. And I would say that, and we talk about resiliency, and it means a lot of different things, but I think one way to think about resiliency is that we're protecting the integrity of the social fabric that allows us to keep making these decisions and keep thinking together and learning from the decisions we made, and like you said, and make the next one together.
Okay, so then I'm going to ask you to get back into your integrative framework and
Sure.
just put a sharper picture on these three lenses that you sort of differentiate. You differentiate values and valuation, process and governance, and power and inequality. So can you
Yeah.
just kind of describe what you mean by those categories?
Yeah. And let me also just say, in a 2023 paper, at a conference, in 2020 or so, I met a researcher, Federica Russo, and she was intrigued by that work, and she wanted to add a fourth lens called science and evidence. So there's actually a paper out there where you add a fourth lens. So the point is, when you're facing complex trade-offs, or when you're trying to kind of get your head around them, and this came from, I remember, you know, Juan Luis de Mert, a member of the Peruvian team, and he had been talking with his colleagues from Peru, and they were really thinking in terms of lenses. What does it mean to look at something through a lens, like on a camera, and then look at it through a different lens? These are the different lenses if you look at our Navigating Complex Trade-offs paper. So the first lens is values and valuation. So we ask the question of like, okay, what matters to the variety of people involved? And also, how are we counting what matters?
Yeah.
So that's the first set of questions that we can ask. What matters? How are we counting it? The second set of questions we can ask, process and governance, is, okay, what are the existing procedures for kind of comparing and balancing out these different values and actually making decisions? And governance is like, what are the larger institutions of governance that are at play here? So we're not just trying to understand like what's on the two sides of a seesaw, or maybe what's on the multiple sides of a picture like a multi-sided seesaw, but also kind of what's that fulcrum beneath it that's weighing and balancing things? What are the social processes for doing that? We want to ask questions and try to understand that the best we can. The third question is power and inequality. Are there forces? Are there strings attached to those seesaws, right, that are being pulled from somewhere and
Mm.
weighted down on one side or pulled up on the other side, if you will? Those could be explicit, money and other forms of power can be shaping, what we're counting, right? Somebody's paying us to count some stuff and somebody's paying us not to count some other stuff. or maybe just they're paying us to count some stuff and the other stuff's not getting counted. There's implicit forms of power too, you know, particularly the power of framing something. I was just reading an article, maybe 10 years ago, in the United States, at least, there was a lot of focus on nudge based
Yeah.
policies. And the idea here being, you give people little nudges to make them kind of make the right choices. And that could be about their retirement savings, but it could also be about their environmental impact. And this article was saying that if you look at some of like even carbon footprint, the idea of a carbon footprint, which is all about individual behavior. And maybe I can be nudged to minimize my carbon footprint. And that could be a whole set of policies, right? All of us measuring our carbon footprints and thinking about how we can fly less, et cetera, which, not to say that may not be important, but in fact, it turns out that it was oil companies that kind of funded the development of the carbon footprint metric. And some of the early anti-littering public service messages were funded by the plastics industry, apparently. And what is this saying here? This is saying that by framing these issues as kind of individual level
Yeah.
choices, and then by creating policy that tries to, shape our individual choices, and then that's what policy is, we're not looking at regulations about plastics and how much plastics we should even be producing, or should we make the producer responsible for those plastics through the life cycle, of their use and throwing away, et cetera. So what kind of policies and laws would do that? And so you can see the power of framing to shape what we're counting, how it's being counted. We're doing this wonderful counting of carbon footprinting, but maybe we're missing the whole point, or at least missing some important points. We ask questions about power to frame issues and how those play into existing patterns, social patterns. And then we can obviously ask questions about science and evidence. What are the different types of evidence at play? And how are we comparing different evidence for different kinds of phenomenon. Some may be statistical, some may be looking at mechanism. My colleague's really area of expertise is sort of these epistemological comparisons.
I'm seeing how all of these categories interact a lot. I mean, even valuation, how do we measure the value categories? How do we define, like you say, the value categories that we even think of? I'm trying to think about how this applies to the deep sea mining in terms of the sort of narratives that we tend to all kind of default to in having these conversations. I had a conversation with Andrew Thaler, a deep sea biologist, who kind of said, even like a term like biodiversity, we define that in a certain way, and that his argument is the way we define biodiversity is very terrestrial focused, because we have only ever experienced kind of terrestrial ecosystems in our lives. And so the way that we would make a biodiversity metric, or even just framings around biodiversity, have embedded assumptions in them. I mean, man, talk about complexity. Once you start to see all of the different ways that lines are being drawn places, you realize that the world
It's
is a
an
messy
opportunity,
place.
though. I mean, that resonates with me, that point about biodiversity, because it's sort of a made-up term. Thomas Lovejoy, I guess, and E.O. Wilson, sort of, in the 60s, 70s, and it's had a lot of power, but it was sort of brought together at a time and space, and they were mostly looking at the Amazon and, diverse species. So it seems like what would be a meaningful way to talk about things in the deep sea context in terms of whether other species or the matrix of life. It seems like a good challenge, right? To come up with terms, ways of talking that are meaningful in the context that you're talking about, and not to be limited by something that maybe emerged in a different context, or at least to recognize its limitations. That does seem important. There's so much metaphor embedded in these specific terms. There's so
Yeah.
much richness, and it may not fit the issues that we're dealing with, and it may lead our thinking down in paths that may be less creative or not even helpful.
Tell me about how this sort of conversation gets received in your experience. So when you get whatever you put into a consortium, and there's scientists, and maybe there's some stakeholders who are affected by a particular issue, and they are about to start quantifying and valuing, and then you come in and say, okay, guys, we're going to think about these things from different lenses. We're going to start talking about process and governance and power and values. How do people react? Do you get buy-in? Do you get resistance? Do you get difficulty in translation?
Yeah, kind of all of the above. You're not doing everything kind of in one room with everybody there at the same time. You're
Yeah.
having multiple different conversations with people in ways that kind of work for them. I mean, I think as you do in your podcast, right? Where you're talking to somebody and you're being in dialogue with them on terms that are meaningful to them. Maybe if you develop that kind of trust, then maybe you can bring people in the room together and build on that. And, we were able to do that in some of that early work. It's very challenging for one reason, because some ways of understanding problems and framing problems not only are different, but sort of actively critical of other ways of framing
Okay.
problems. If you're looking through a certain lens, it's not just that cost benefit analysis is lacking information, and maybe that it's actively seen as a harmful thing to be putting dollar values on certain aspects of the environment. Because what? Then that implies they can be sort of traded off. There's a fungibility, right? Everything is substitutable for everything else, right? Just because
Right.
right, they kind of, you can see it go down that slippery slope. So now, like, one person's way of looking at things is no longer neutral, seen from another. I mean, I don't want to claim that we've figured it out or anything, but I think the idea of those different lenses, it goes back to that Monday, Tuesday thing, right? Listen, there can be value on putting as much as we can in dollar terms. Let's do that on Monday. And let's allow
Yeah.
people,
Yeah.
because the people who do that, they're not naive, right? They understand that there's a lot of assumptions that go into that. They probably spent the last 20 years thinking about those assumptions. They simplify complexity, but those of us who might be overly critical of that are not appreciating the complexity that they've grappled with in their simplification, right? They certainly have, right? And anybody who's looked at these issues is aware of that. So I think we need to not be naively accusing each other of being, reductionists.
Yeah.
Anybody who makes these assumptions has thought about it deeply. So let's go with that. Let's make space for that. Presumably, those folks can also recognize that there's stuff outside of those assumptions. There's other ways those assumptions could have gone, or there's other choices. If we can let go of the integrated, our brains want everything to fit in the same type of puzzle. And that's very hard. I think this was Pete Brosius again, or maybe one of his students or colleagues, who talked about tolerance for ambiguity. Can we cultivate tolerance for ambiguity in ourselves and others? Which is another way of saying tolerance for when things aren't integrated and fitting together well. But we can still learn from that. And then, by the time we get to Thursday, we can look from a really critical lens. How is the process of counting, how is that in itself a force that really functions to disempower specific people in specific places at specific points in time? How are our own efforts at conservation playing out patterns of dominance and subordination that are part of larger systems at play? And even though I think I want to save the rainforest, there's a certain set of assumptions and ideas and embedded in that sometimes is worth to check oneself on, right? Or to check ourselves collectively on. We're not doing that on Monday. There's no
Yeah.
room for that conversation on Monday, but on Thursday, there should be room for that conversation. I think it's really important and very difficult to really make space for those different types of conversations to happen in their own sort of languages, right? Their own metaphors, with appropriate guidelines or boundaries or whatever we have, so that we're generally focused on, again, coming up with what is important to protect and how can we do that over time.
I mean, that's super cool. And I think super helpful to have covered back over the ground that we were essentially talking about an hour ago, and having you say, what is actually really important to spend some time in the language of the integrated. It's not just to come in and say, okay, guys, we're going to be recognizing the different value categories. I said this in a meeting the other day, actually, that the IPBES framework has recently, kind of acknowledged that we shouldn't collapse valuation categories into a single metric. Because they had said, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could kind of integrate all of this information and somehow put it into one single value category, maybe a financial value category. And I was like, well, no, that's the wrong direction to go. So it's great to hear. We should spend, as part of the whole process, is like, yeah, let's do that for a while. Let's do that and the other thing also.
Yes.
What about publishing or being in the kind of like normie scientific world in this sort of thing, when you are talking with scientists and you're kind of doing this sort of work, and then at the end of the day, whoever's going to put their name on the output, they want to then translate it into the language of their own discipline?
Well, I think, hey, that could be fine. I mean, for them to do that, but I think there's also space for collaborative work. Those papers on trade-offs and complex trade-offs, and they've been cited over 1,000 times. I think part of the reason is because talking about things which lots of people care about and think about and don't necessarily get to talk about in the very specialized kind of language. But I think there's space in every journal has room, or different journals have room for kind of larger conversations, right? And that's often where they take place. It's try and fail sometimes or find your way in. But hey, I think there's rooms for taking sort of bigger picture looks at things. I don't know if that's what you're asking. I mean, that's how academia works, right? You come up with a nice framework and then people use it or change it. And I find that part kind of fun. Other people may be focusing on something different, but I think there's room in academia for, especially now. I was just having this conversation earlier today, because we're talking about, bringing PhD students into our department, and the other departments at our institution are, more natural science focused, maybe traditional disciplines. And ours really is including social sciences and in an interdisciplinary sense, even transdisciplinary in some ways. But I think that I don't want to use the term synthesize, but I want to, being able to think, because synthesize is sort of like integrate, right?
Mm.
And I didn't want to use that, but being able to be somebody who can deal with different types of information and the social messiness of it, and not get completely lost and have some tolerance for the ambiguity. I mean, there is training, right? There is things we can read and things we can learn from each other, and to develop as people who maybe are going to be more functional, operating in the space of this complexity in productive ways, right? It's not perfect. It's an art as much of a science. I think there's certainly space for it in academia, and in the interstitial spaces between academia and other contexts.
Yeah, and I mean, now that you mention it, it's interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity is, I mean, I've only been in academia or in research for a few years now, and I'm starting to realize that, you know, all of these things that I used to first encountered as just like, oh, that's just a buzzword. That's just,
Mm,
we want to have a transdisciplinary team approaching this
yeah.
problem. I'm seeing now that at least in some cases there's real substance to these ideas. I guess I want to ask some sort of question about how people do this badly, because it seems to me that it can be done badly, that interdisciplinary working can just be frustrating and unproductive.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I want to say before that too, there are, there's the Association for Interdisciplinary Studies, and there's, I think in more in Europe, there's one, the Association for Transdisciplinary Studies, and those are people spend time around and been part of those organizations, and in fact, one of those papers I mentioned is published in their journal because they made space for this type of inquiry, right?
Mm,
But people think really hard and deep about what it takes to be. There's people looking at it philosophically, and there's people looking at it practically. There's people looking at it methodologically. There's a lot of thinking and work done, and what it takes to be meaningfully interdisciplinary, and also meaningful transdisciplinarily, which usually is taken to mean, not just across different disciplines, but including stakeholders, including people from different communities
okay.
and cultural contexts, and which is a whole nother set of challenges, right? And we have to think a lot there about issues of who gets to frame the problem, and how we're talking about things in meaningful ways. So there's a lot of people who work very hard on those things. And then how does it go badly? I mean, the classic way, that we complain about in the social science is when people are saying, oh, we need a social scientist to do a survey to go along with our project that we've already figured out. I think it goes badly when people don't get the opportunity to collaborate in formulating the problem together,
Mm,
and where they're just kind of stuck on to for sort of instrumental purposes, and they don't get to put their minds around how do they grapple with complexity, be part of the thinking, the framing of the issues kind of at the outset. Not to say that, of course, people might have different specialties, that they can be added on. But I think when you don't appreciate, sort of at the outset that your colleagues are, grappling with complexity in their own terms, but you already simplify things for them, then you're minimizing their contributions and sort of instrumentalizing them. And when you don't put adequate space and time to struggling with some of these challenges, and that takes funding often, and support, or being creative and finding ways to do it in the online space or what have you. but just, putting the time into having these hard conversations.
It seems like it also takes having an interest in other people's work, having now had a few years of kind of being put into relatively large projects where there's people doing some sort of modeling and other people doing some sort of sustainability analysis and other
Hmm.
people
Hmm.
doing, and I'm kind of like, okay, well, I've got my role and I see that we're all working towards the same outcome, but and at the, whatever the big consortium meetings, I'm, I don't think necessarily always adequately interested in learning what the other people are actually doing and
Mm,
understanding what it is they're actually saying, because it takes place in a different language
yeah.
and it's on a different problem that doesn't obviously really make a difference for my problem. And so I'm seeing just in this conversation with you that if we're going to do interdisciplinarity, then it also means actually getting involved in the other people's discipline a little bit.
Yeah, that resonates. Absolutely. Generally, being interested in people is a great way to build rapport and trust and collaboration. And inviting them. I mean, I think what you're doing here is also part of that, right? You're inviting people into your space, and probably you'll continue to figure out ways to open up the doors in that regard.
Okay, well, I feel like people have now been listening for uh, over an hour of me just kind of having some fairly basic realizations that I probably should have had earlier in my career trying to do collaborative research. But this has been, I mean, yeah, I think this has been super fun, super interesting. Obviously, I reached out to you because I think this is a incredibly interesting topic. So the papers that we've been talking about, one is hard choices, making trade-offs between biodiversity conservation and human well-being. And that was 2011 in the Journal of Biological Conservation.
Hmm.
Another is acknowledging conservation trade-offs and embracing complexity. I've got that as 2011 Conservation Biology. Is that a different
Yep.
journal?
That's a different journal. Yeah.
Biological conservation and
Yes, two
conservation
different
biology.
journals.
Amazing. And then, yeah, navigating complex trade-offs in conservation and development, an integrative framework. I think this is
Yeah.
the one that we've been spending the most time on. That was 2013, issues in interdisciplinary studies. So people can look those up. I'll put the links in the show notes to this podcast. But yeah, then where else would you send, like if I was coming knocking at your door 2 years ago saying, where should I look to start figuring out interdisciplinarity and trade-offs, where would you send me?
Where would I send you other than those papers? And there's others too. If you kind of use those as a starting point, you see who cited those. You can sort of worm your way through. But I guess you're asking me more broadly. I know this isn't exactly what you asked, but I think wherever you are, you're probably in the midst of some complex trade-offs that you're dealing with, right?
Mhm.
So I mean, I kind of want to say start in the situation you're in, right? And just give yourself the space to, see what it feels like to tolerate a little bit of ambiguity, right? And see what comes out of that. But I mean, I think you're also asking, tangible thing, where can you go? I mean, I think there was a lot of people that were involved in some of those initial papers, and I don't even think that's. I really think in a discipline like environmental studies is the place you get to think about this type of thing. I mean, that's I think why I appreciate the department that I'm in and the field that we're trying to articulate. Environmental studies is it's not just like random interdisciplinary space. It's a space where we can really recognize there are multiple disciplines that we need to be able to engage with, and none of us are going to be experts in all of them. And there's social things in social contexts are messy. Um, and we need some kind of tools and ways of thinking and just like reminders to take a step back, sort of humility reminders, right? And
Mhm.
so I'm not saying we have this all figured out, but I think that when you can find these sort of interdisciplinary departments, they're often places where people have at least done different work in this direction. And we just, if you're giving me the chance to make a plug here, I don't know if you are, but I mean, we did just develop a PhD in environmental studies before you, and which people could look at, at SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and we also have online um, programs. Myself, I,
Mhm.
I run our online graduate certificate in environmental leadership, which is 3 courses that I teach, and in decision making and in policy and in philosophy and ethics around these kind of issues. And if you have an undergraduate degree and take those 3 courses, you earn that certificate, and that certificate can be stacked on with a couple of others to earn a master's degree from our institution. And so our efforts sort of trying to create a community.
What are you working on now, research-wise?
Yeah, my PhD advisor, Brian Norton, who this was 20 years ago or so that I finished that process, but we just decided to write another paper together, and we just finished it about trust and what it takes to think about trust at the level of a system, trust that happens between people and in the context of relationships. So that's one issue. And then I guess the other thing that, I continually think about are the concept of leadership and the practice of leadership. But when we're dealing with, issues that spill across boundaries and issues that we're probably not the one in charge for, and maybe probably there's nobody in charge. And yet we need to somehow exercise. What does it even mean then to exercise leadership in the context of these multifaceted, boundary crossing, complex trade-off issues? Some sort of facilitative leadership, I would say, but I'm just really thinking about what that means. And then, extending that complex trade-offs is, it's really not good enough to say that, hey, there's complex trade-offs. We need to be able to say, what are we going to do? And so I'm working on this concept of, which I mentioned earlier, the workable good. That's my at least tentative language around what does it mean to move forward in the context of a complex trade-off. We need to find a workable good. There's one paper that should come out soon, but I'm trying to really articulate and think about what is a workable good in the context of complex trade-offs and how might we find that through thinking together.
It sounds initially a similar to whatever sufficientarianism or sufficiency. What's the difference between a workable good and just looking for a sufficient outcome?
Yeah, or are you talking about like the satisficing idea too?
Yeah, that's the right word.
Yeah,
satisficing. I knew there was a buzzword that has cropped up.
There's a
in the
buzzword,
last
Herbert
few
Simon,
years.
satisficing, right? The idea that what are the minimal sort of acceptable parameters for? It's actually, I think that's right. In one level, a workable good is something that's kind of good enough at certain levels. But I also think this idea of workability, like I mentioned earlier, that no matter what choice we make, we kind of have to do work. Workable good is like it's a workable scenario. It's a scenario where we're going to be able to do some work that is going to have at least a decent chance of succeeding to protect what we care about. Workable also gives this idea of sort of a plasticity, right? Like it's flexible. We're going to have to learn as we go and continue to evolve and shape, the answers that we're. I'm not saying anything like it doesn't have intrinsic substance, but it needs to have some workability to it, right? As we go and we learn. It's definitely in that line of satisficing thinking that I'm trying to add some aspects to that, which really take into account, long-term unpredictable futures and just the kind of complexities that I've been thinking about, myself and others have been thinking about.
It seems like you bite off ideas, concepts that are really central to problems that we're dealing with, but are difficult to define.
Yeah.
And then I can see why there would be like a tendency in science to circle around the ideas that are well-defined and well-workable. And then these other ideas that are more difficult to get your teeth into, more difficult to communicate on, more difficult to actualize, that even though they are very central, and this is what I feel like is the case with trade-offs, it's a very central concept. Everybody recognizes it. It's just so messy and difficult. It's hard to make into a science that then it gets kind of set to the side because cost-benefit analysis is just actually workable. So it seems like you prefer to hang out in these, important concepts that are really difficult to put a point on.
Yeah, I think that's a good take.
Okay, well, keep doing it. And
you too.
Thank you for your work. Thanks for taking the time. You mentioned that paper with Brian Norton about trust, and I hope that we'll get a chance to discuss that with Brian upcoming. So listeners, I think, can stay tuned for that upcoming. As usual, normal podcast sign-off things. Subscribe, please share this episode with people who you think might find it interesting. I found it very interesting. Thanks a lot for being here, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Okay, we'll talk next time.